digital policy incubator, and Alina Polyakova, who's president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis. They've co-authored a paper calling for renewed strategic cooperation, greater unity in effect, between the US and Europe on tech policy. It's called A Transatlantic Effort on China Starts with Technology. Only unity on tech policy can keep democracy's competitive edge. And it's very timely. The EU is about to come out with a legislative package, a bunch of other measures as well, on what it hopes will deliver digital autonomy and sovereignty for itself. And the US is transitioning to the Biden administration. And more generally, we've seen that tech and politics are now completely intertwined. Nearly every country in the world is also in recession. So the need for innovation and the pressure to create types of innovation that create jobs as well is greater than ever. So let's dive into it. Let's start with the paper. Eileen, I'll turn to you first. Is the bottom line that the West is doomed to fall behind China in pretty much most digital fields if we don't figure out a better way to cooperate?
Well, we certainly are calling for more strategic cooperation. And as we all know, there have been many, many conversations about technology and democracy popping up all over the place. Our argument is that there's a little bit too much focus on technology as the problem, and especially US platforms as the enemy, and not enough geopolitical strategic awareness of the threat posed by China, and in particular, its model of digital authoritarianism.
And Alina, if I could turn to you to ask a little bit about where you see the flaws at the moment in both the US and the EU silos. They're different approaches, both to the regulation and to the general norms around technology. And then if you could explain where you think there is a realistic scope for common ground.
Just to directly pick up on where Eileen left off, first of all, Ryan, thank you for that question. One of the points that we are trying to get across in this paper is that not only have we got the enemy wrong in some ways, with the intent to really focus, especially in Brussels right now, on regulation primarily on US tech companies. It's also that in many ways, Brussels tends to treat US companies or companies more broadly that are based in democratic countries at the same the same playing field as companies from authoritarian states, most notably China. And some of what we know about the regulatory package that Brussels is going to unveil very soon is that it's really taking on the lens of market competition. But technology and competition or technological innovation isn't just about economics. It's not just about markets. It is very much about a normative competition to be able to set the international agenda, the rules of the road when it comes to data use, when it comes to privacy, when it comes to a whole slew of other issues. And Eileen can certainly talk much more about that, but I think that is the big problem here, that digital sovereignty as a model for understanding the best way to regulate tech is problematic because it sets up what we call digital walled gardens, meaning it really prohibits our ability to work together to first and foremost ensure that we maintain a digital domain that is democratic first and foremost, and not see the space to an authoritarian sort of model of a splinter net, which is of course what China has successfully set up. It's what other authoritarian states would love to emulate. And the language of digital sovereignty in many ways, lends legitimacy and credibility to that whole idea of fragmentation. And if we lose that battle, the normative battle, then, in effect, we lose the ability to ensure that we have a digital domain that is open and free and based in values of human rights, first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Eileen, if I could get you to respond there to Alina, I wonder how much you see that problem Alina has just explained as being around a kind of naivety about what China's approach and model is, and how much of it is just that typical problem of a regulator fighting the last war, where they know there are excesses among the big technology companies, they've struggled to figure out how to deal with it, and they're just catching up to that problem when the new one, i.e. the China model, has already landed on top of them.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, naivete and focused on the past problem. And I would say that in the transatlantic context, we've been sort of fighting with each other. There's been a lot of dysfunction in the US political context. So we've sort of been missing in action on the policy front. But the Europeans have kind of set up this false equivalence between the United States and China as equally ominous threats. And we're basically arguing that they need to pick their heads up and look at the much bigger geopolitical threat that we face together. And it really is, as Alina said, a global narrative battle over the governance model that will dominate in 21st century digitized society. And our argument is democracies must work together, and we have a lot of work to do. But on the China side, while we've been fighting, they have been making massive progress. And I will lay out, the core elements of their entire model of digital authoritarianism starts with a very ambitious strategic investment agenda, where they have roughly 16 different Manhattan Project level investments in technology itself, quantum communications, crypto, facial recognition, genomics, et cetera. And part of what we're arguing is, and this is what I think that the EU has largely missed, is that if you care about leadership in the policy realm, in the normative realm, in digitized society, you also must invest in and lead on technology innovation. That power in the normative realm will derive, in fact, from dominance in technology. And China seems to know that very well. The other elements I will mention that we're very concerned about is obviously role modeling utilization of technology for repressive purposes, surveillance, mass surveillance, censorship. Xinjiang is kind of the poster child of a digital context moving toward totalitarian control of people. They also have a massive export agenda for not only surveillance technologies of repression, but digital infrastructure through which they are gaining leverage over countries all around the world, and that will be leverage for decades to come. And then the next piece that I think a lot of players have missed, it's much more subtle, is in the international diplomacy realm, where they're at the general level, they've taken over leadership at 4 of the 16 UN agencies, where just a decade ago, they were barely engaged in diplomacy at the UN level. They've gone into text standard setting. They've gone into norm standard setting. So the ITU, the Human Rights Council. But the big battle is really over this model of cyber sovereignty and convincing the globe that democracy is on the way out, human rights are no longer tenable, and that technology is ultimately about state control.
Mm-hmm. It feels to me like if we had a forum, and I'm not advocating that we create a new forum, but we can get to that in the conversation too. But if we had a forum like NATO for tech cooperation, we would have channeled something like a call for that greater level of defense investment that Donald Trump has made so famous. We would have been calling for greater investments in strategic technology sectors. And to me, that all then points towards some form of new modern industrial policy. And I know that the EU is sort of touching on those topics, but I wonder what you feel about that. Is there some kind of framework where the EU and the US could get involved in having common standards and common restraints around what an industrial policy could be that would take their investments to a level that we would be able to outcompete China?
I can start there. That's exactly the point that we get to at the end of this paper. I want to make it clear that I think we all agree that we need some sort of regulatory framework around technology, whether that comes to social media platforms or larger issues around cloud computing and things of that nature. Yes, we need a regulatory agenda, no question about it. But we can't have, fragmentation in that regulatory agenda. Unfortunately, the launch of the Brussels package that we've been discussing, the Digital Services Act, and the Digital Market Act that we're foreseeing before the end of the year, I think it could have waited a little bit. It could have until the Biden administration was fully in place. And then that would have been a great basis. You asked about cooperation earlier, to start a cooperative process and to think through establishing, Ryan, what you are referring to is some sort of body or council, a commission, to start having these strategic conversations. And I was, on the one hand, very, very happy to see the commission actually put out a EU-US agenda, which included tech policy as one of the core items, this agenda that the commission published calling for a global agenda for the United States and the EU. And there were great ideas in there. One of them was to set up a trade and technology council or commission that would start to grapple with some of these questions at the transatlantic level. There were other fantastic recommendations, but at the same time, as we have this call, which I think the US should take quite seriously to collaborate, we have this other regulatory effort that's been in the works for quite some time still being launched. So I think we can't have it both ways. We can't have a call for unity and collaboration while still, ramming through a new digital agenda that has not been done in collaboration with the United States. So I think there's a huge amount to think through, and there are different models for doing it, as you said. I don't think we need a new bureaucracy, frankly, where we have, a coalition of 20-something or 30-something countries, and we have to go through this arduous process of voting and things like that. That takes forever. We don't have time for that, frankly. There have been many proposals on the table of how to do this in a more focused, perhaps in even a temporary way, so that there are working groups that perhaps set up between countries that are driving, let's say, on semiconductor development, for example, or countries that are driving on cloud technologies, and to really have concrete problems and solutions, not necessarily at this huge level like NATO or another multilateral organization, but to do that in a very concrete, focused ways. The point is that we can do this, we just haven't. And the one reason for that, I think has been the EU's focus on digital regulation paired with incoherence of foreign policy in the United States for the last 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Eileen, if I could get you to pick that thought up, what difference do you think a Biden administration will make? We know that the Obama administration that Joe Biden served in was very pro-Silicon Valley, and we also know that the days of those sort of blank checks are over. So what will Biden demand, and what can he offer to the EU to meet them around their ideas?
So I think that having a Biden administration is probably the most important change. The fact that we have moved away from Donald Trump, who I would argue single-handedly he may have been the most detrimental factor himself in the breakdown of the Transatlantic Alliance, just with his behavior and treatment of his partners. And so it's very important that he's not there. But I will say that at the end of the Obama administration, if we recall, the Privacy Shield arrangement that facilitated cross-border data transfer was negotiated as an alternative to the earlier safe harbor arrangement. And just this summer, the EU Court of Justice struck that down as unconstitutional. And I would say one of the first things that this should be an urgent priority for the EU and the United States to come up with an acceptable alternative to the Privacy Shield. That leads me to not only because of trade and the economic consequences, but at the end of the day, the problem from the EU point of view with that arrangement points to something that I think democratic governments are failing to look at, which is their own use of data and technology for government purposes. Everybody is so focused on private sector platforms and regulation of platforms as though that's the be all and end all, and that's the solution for saving democracy. They're forgetting that we have inadequate rules on government surveillance, and the digitization of everything has sort of created this unconscious drift toward mass surveillance for all governments. And so the first step for this transatlantic alliance is get your own houses in order. The governments need to come up with a democratic articulation of how we have institutional constraints on use of data and technology for government. And that is the biggest differentiator between the transatlantic partners and China. So that's step number one. Step number two, yes, we need regulation of platforms, the dominant platforms. But rather than focus on harmful content and coming up with rules that in their own way violate core democratic principles like free expression, the focus should be, and I believe in the Biden administration will be, on transparency and accountability, starting with transparency about rules for users and new forms of user control over what happens to their data, new forms of transparency about procedural rights, mechanisms for complaint mechanisms, remedies for violations, focusing on the users, and then also ability for regulators and researchers to audit the platforms in terms of their own execution on promises. Are they doing what they have promised? And then last but not least is, what are the effects of algorithmic promotion and demotion of content, independent of cross-border, foreign info ops? What is the actual effect of what platforms are doing in that gray zone? That's why transparency, which sounds so boring, actually could do a tremendous amount in educating the regulators.
You were reading my mind. You've taken me to the exact two questions that I was hoping to ask next. So the first was, on that point of transparency, do you think that extends into what I would call algorithmic transparency? Essentially, the ability in exceptional circumstances or on a regular basis of some kind for authorities to essentially audit how these algorithms are conducted as a way to avoid the content removal laws that could be on the horizon. That's point one. And then point two is on Privacy Shield. I wonder whether the US is going to have to come up with another workaround because a federal privacy law is unrealistic given the Congress. And a lot of people would argue that for it to hold up in an EU court, the gold standard would be a US federal privacy regime.
Do you want me to quickly answer those? Yeah. Okay, so on the Privacy Shield workaround, yes, I would have put federal privacy law at the top of the list, but you are probably right. It's not quite ripe yet or realistic. I think we're more likely to get transparency and accountability on platforms. So yes, I do think we're going to need a workaround, but here's where it's a two-way partnership. The European Court of Justice effectively said US surveillance practices need to change. And unless the EU is willing to articulate what would be required, the idea that the US is going to change its surveillance practices so that private sector platforms are able to transfer data back and forth. I mean, I think they have to get a little bit more realistic in understanding what they're asking for. This really stems back to the Snowden revelations. And we've almost never recovered from those US government practices that were be outside of adequate institutional constraints. And so that's what has to be arranged behind closed doors between the European Union and the US, is what are the government practices? And then your first question, it was, algorithmic transparency.
Algorithmic transparency.
So it's, on that one, I would say people should understand there's subtlety in the language. We should not be asking companies to hand over the algorithms. That's not what we're interested in. But we are interested in an ability to audit the effects of the algorithmic promotion and demotion. So we want to better understand, what are the decision rules? What were you intending to bake into the algorithms? And then audit, is that what happened? And we would all be better off if we were more sophisticated in understanding what it means to live and work in algorithmic systems. That is really the first step in educating regulators and, in fact, educating the public and building civic resilience against a lot of these disinformation problems.
Alina, maybe if I can bring you back in. I'm also interested in what you see as parts of the American innovation ecosystem that the EU could adopt. They've had challenges for a long time about the amount of venture capital they have had access to. I'd probably argue we're seeing now in the pandemic that venture capital doesn't always deliver the investments you want for your society. But it's also clear that the EU needs to do more of this investment in fundamental research and to innovate more rather than just try and pull others down. What is your thoughts on how they could do that?
Well, I think one of the things that has become very obvious is that sometimes there is sort of a overzealousness when it comes to the EU's desire to lead as a global digital regulator. European laws around privacy, like the GDPR, for example, have a tendency to become de facto globally adopted because they apply to companies that are transnational global companies. So when the EU acts, it's not just actually acting for its own citizens at the end of the day, it is acting for the world. And I think that is a huge amount of power that Brussels actually has. I think the issue has been, though, that in some ways it is regulation that has become the objective in itself, rather than what should be the objective, which is innovation and investing in basic research and development and science. Obviously, everybody wants to recreate Silicon Valley. The Chinese have been trying to do it, the Russians have been trying to do it. Everyone is trying to do it because it's such a powerhouse of innovation and drives so much economic growth. However, what that really takes is having a regulatory environment that prioritizes, cutting red tape and bureaucracy around starting your own business, that allows startups to flourish without a lot of, government paperwork they have to fill out. France is famous for many things, but one of the things it's also very famous for is having this really deep bureaucratic model of development. And for innovation, that really doesn't work, especially when we're talking about tech innovation. So I think one of the things is just changing the mindset first and foremost, and thinking about not how do we regulate and protect our own industry, which may be inefficient in some ways, but how do we actually build a partnership with the United States where we can invest together? One of the things we recommend in the paper is that the EU and the United States consider a joint fund, a public fund that would focus on investment in specific technologies, one of them being, of course, AI technologies and data technologies around cloud, et cetera, rather than trying to have, every country has its own cloud or every country has its own model of data use. That's not going to get us anywhere. And that fund could potentially channel public funding, public investment, government investment into specific areas as a way to jumpstart private investment and hopefully to build truly competitive companies rather than, having a subsidy model where at the end of the day, basically what European governments might end up doing is subsidizing inefficient models. I mean, there's a reason, right, why not too many companies have been able to compete with Google search. Google search is ubiquitous. We can argue about whether it's too ubiquitous, right? And saw the arguments about antitrust. But one reason is because it works really well. And everybody that's tried to compete with it hasn't done very well. Well, because they have a superior product. So I think European companies have to find a niche for where they can be competitive. And that can only happen from this bottom-up approach and a regulatory framework that encourages innovations rather than stifle it. I mean, none of this is rocket science, really, in some ways, but it's really just about changing the way we're looking at the bigger problem and panning out from arguments we're having about individual data privacy and surveillance, which are valid, not to say they're not, but to see the bigger picture. Like if we keep fighting amongst ourselves, someone's going to have our cake, and that's going to be China.
I guess it's now time to ask you what role you see for the existing private sector actors. And I would include civil society, not just the big companies here. And the reason I ask that is that the sort of technology partnerships that governments have to be involved in are necessarily very complicated. It's not a sphere where you can just buy the software or whatever it is and never talk to the company again. Like, these are quite difficult hybrid environments. And I've also been on the other end of sort of big tech lobbying when I worked inside the EU's digital department and its competition department. And it can be a really tough dynamic when you're dealing with huge companies populated by people who think they're the smartest people on the planet. And it quickly can turn into sort of a battle of ego and a policy war rather than a collaboration. And I was just wondering what role you'd like to see those private actors playing in this whole situation. Maybe Eileen, if you can go first.
Sure. So I think the top line for me is going back to this concept of digital sovereignty that has been perking up in the EU context. And I think what we're really talking about is we need the democratic world to band together and create a democratic approach to all of this, including a shared strategic approach to technology investment, as Alina said, especially for critical supply chains, 5G, semiconductors, emerging technologies where we have to compete and lead. That requires, I mean, if you really want to do that in a way that's as ambitious as China's model, where we've seen in their context a sort of a military private sector fusion, and where the state sort of controls everything the private sector does, we really need partnership, not only among the Transatlantic Alliance, but with the private sector. This is a call to action. This is a moonshot. This is a geopolitical moment where the private sector needs to be working with democratic governments and understanding their responsibilities to the democratic societies in which they operate. And so I think we just all have to get on a much more constructive path. And I think the way that happens is recognizing this geopolitical threat and that we all face it together.
Mm-hmm. And I guess we're getting to towards the end of the conversation now, but maybe if I pick a live example like artificial intelligence technologies, I wonder if that's a useful case study in the sense that because they are new or emerging, it's not so much that you have to build a very long, fragile bridge between these two existing universes, but it's all developing at the same time. And we haven't yet really regulated this space. Does that give us more scope to develop guidance, norms, pre-regulatory measures that keep us on the same page? Yes.
The United States is still in the lead on AI tech development. We probably have about a 2-year lead. We do not have a decade lead. So the first thing is understanding how AI will enable other development of technology, and it has to be prioritized. China has made becoming the global superpower in AI, top of its agenda. They plan to get there by 2030. They were hoping to tie with us by roughly now, and they're getting closer, but I think there's increasing attention to the significance and the need for greater US investment. So that's there. But your point is about the norms. You're right. The good news is, I think that the civil liberties community, the research community, civil society, and the human rights community, and frankly, is really focused on norms for AI. And we're in fact ahead of the curve in some ways in understanding the wide range of risks associated with AI for all the dimensions of human rights. And in some ways, we're better placed to deal with those threats than we were in, watching digital platforms, the internet take off, where nobody really had a clue about how to think about regulation. Back in those days where it was like, oh, the internet's great and all it will do is help exercise free expression, we sort of let it go and it took us a decade to sort of recognize some of it is dark. I think with AI, people have caught on early, but recognize that it should not squelch tech development just because you're doing normative development. This is one of our arguments. They must go hand in hand, and that's what the Democratic Alliance needs to understand.
And Alina, do you have any AI thoughts to add, or another example you wanted to introduce before we move into final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just to second what Eileen has already said about the lead we currently have and that window of opportunity narrowing more quickly than I think many people realize. And I think on artificial intelligence, I think most individuals living in post-industrialized societies don't really realize how much of their day-to-day is already being driven and underpinned by technologies rooted in artificial intelligence models. You know, I think there's huge consequences if we don't set the rules of the road for this technology to not only develop, you know, in all these disparate ways. There's lots of research happening in this space. One of the ways in which China has a leg up is that there are no rules around data privacy in China that protect human rights, that protect individual rights, which of course means that they have the upside in having access, you know, unlimited access to trillions data points based on their entire citizen population, as well as information they've been collecting on foreigners elsewhere. We need to see data privacy debates more around the issue of, you know, how do we continue to allow access to data as a tool for development of AI technologies. And this is actually where I have to say, I think Brussels has now understood, and very clearly, you know, President von der Leyen has said this in a speech that she gave a little bit ago, that Europe is losing, has lost the race on data. And that is true. The fact that the EU recognized, I think, is step number one. But I think that the broader question about where do we head in terms of artificial intelligence and will we continue to lead, you know, that goes back to what we're talking about earlier. Privacy shield, you know, the ability for companies to have access to data, not personal data. We have to understand that we're not talking about, you know, a company knowing, you know, where you do your shopping, who you call, et cetera. I mean, often these conversations get very conflated. It's about aggregate level, big data, it's anonymized data. That is how you develop artificial intelligence. That is how you have more effective algorithms. China is leading the way here. And we tend to see, you know, we have this instinct to have a backlash and say, want to protect. And yes, we should protect individual data, but that doesn't mean that we have to lock up access to anonymized aggregate level data, big data, from which AI models actually form. So I guess everything always goes back to the kind of rift that we're seeing between Europe and the United States and all of these issues. And when you take, you know, each question one by one, it seems like a whole bunch of disparate questions. You know, there's privacy shield, there's legal cases, antitrust cases against Facebook and Apple and Amazon, all of that stuff. There's, you know, laws around content moderation, transparency, and code of practice. A lot happening. But if we continue to see these as disparate events, what on the whole, if we take the big scope, it is driving wedges in the ability of Europe and the United States to actually work together and to get buy-in from other countries as well, because that's what Beijing is doing. You know, for every step that we take, they set up a counter parallel in their international diplomacy capability to try to get other countries on board with their view of the world. And so we have to get it together and stop fighting about these disparate questions, because at the end of the day, this all feeds into what could be a relatively bleak future, you know, where we lose the competitive race over AI, and not just over AI, over quantum, and a whole slew of other potential technologies.
These are points that are very well taken. Like, if I'm taking away anything from this conversation, it's that, yes, you have to address problems and deficiencies in your own backyard, but you need to understand them in their relative context and what weight to put on them versus this broader global competitive landscape. Eileen, I think we're just about wrapping up the time now. Have you got any final thoughts? I don't want to presume to wrap up all of those threads myself. As a co-author of the paper, I'll let you do that.
Well, let me just add one piece that we have not mentioned. In the plan of action we put forward, there were 3 big planks. One is strategic investment in the technology itself, which we've discussed. We've also talked about coming up with a democratic approach to governance of digital society and regulation of private sector company tech platforms consistent with human rights. Those are the 2 big pieces. A lot to be done there. The third piece is really coming up with a strategy to counter the rise of digital authoritarianism around the globe and China's push to bring the world to its vision. And this will require much deeper investment in international diplomacy. We have to create an attractive democratic model of use of technology, investment in technology, application of technology, and governance, and articulate what are the risks associated with allowing China to control your information infrastructure in the long run. What are the risks associated with the products that are being exported to you? And as well as hopefully the attraction to democratic values, which we still believe are ultimately the ones that will win in sort of a more soft power kind of battle, if we can get our acts together, both on the technology front and the governance front.
Eileen Donahoe, Alina Polyakova, thank you so much for this conversation. I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone watching did as well.